Hello model car fans, welcome to the Muscle Car Modeler. My name is Ralph, and this week I want to feature the most famous car in the world. Really not my title, but it's actually the title of a book by Dave Worrell, I think is how you say that. I apologize, but it's a book about this car, or all four of them. No stranger to cinema here. It's the James Bond 1963 DB5 that was used in the movies Goldfinger and then Thunderball almost right away. Pretty cool car with a lot of features in the spy movies, which is great. You know, obviously a cult classic, and like the book says, the most famous car in the world. I don't know about that. It's kind of hard to say that. Definitely one of the first to really capture cinematography and become a character all its own and really blow up. I mean, you know, it predates the Batmobile and of course Dukes of Hazzard. About the only other thing about the same time period was Lincoln that Kennedy was assassinated in. That could be considered also one of the most famous cars in the world, especially in that time, in the mid-60s. For different reasons, of course. It's hard to dispute that title, though. You know, most famous car in the world, which is pretty cool. You know, the Batmobile's up there. You know, especially if you go with American pop culture. This one pertains to a lot more than just Americans and our love affair with the cars. Cool car, and one that, as far as building the model, is pretty cool. But when it comes to researching the history and the story of the actual cars, quite interesting, which is why I really would like to get my hands on that book and read it. The problem with that book is it was only printed once in 1993, and used copies go between $200 to $350. I was looking again on Amazon just for giggles, and even when I built this model, which this one I think I built about 5 years ago, it's a quick build, but it was going for big money, but there's a lot of history in there, and it really goes over the four cars and their history and everything, but that's all the way up till about 93 when the book was actually printed. So, quite interesting, but I'll get into some of that because when they were making the movie Goldfinger, the actual book, James Bond had a Aston Martin DB3 or Mark III, and that was what was in the book, but that was the current model. When they were making the movie, Aston Martin was coming out with the DB5, which was 63 to 65, and the car they wanted the car. But they couldn't afford the 4,500 pounds it cost to buy the car, which at the time was quite a bit of money for a car, but wasn't outrageous. I mean, but the movie budget, it wasn't there. They could not afford the car. So they had talked to Aston Martin, and they actually gave them the prototype car. It was actually a DB4, and it was modified, and it was the prototype to the DB5. They actually loaned the production company that car, and they were allowed to modify it, and they put all of the stuff on it that is shown, all the Bond gadgets. They put all of that stuff in it, modified it, and they were using it and enjoying it. It's also the only one that Sean Connery actually drove. Now, unfortunately, Sean Connery passed away this past weekend at the age of 90. And I was already researching and planning to do this video and refreshing my notes when that happened. So it kind of coincides with this, and it wasn't intentional. But I was thinking I was going to do this one, just be a little bit different. And the story behind the car is just wonderful. So anyway, the production company did all the modifications, and most of them worked fairly well. You know, all props, but they actually made them fairly functional. And as production had rolled, and they realized they actually needed a second car, so they asked Aston Martin again, you know, could you loan us a second one? Because this was on loan. Aston Martin actually owned it, so they gave him another production DB5. Sean Connery only drove the prototype, the first one, and they put all the gadgets in that one. The second one was a gadget car, but I guess they didn't put all the gadgets in it. It was more of a picture car, but it's really confusing. But they give you the chassis numbers, and I kind of focused on those two. So they refer to one as the road car, and Haggerty has a really nice article that really went over both of these and some of the history. But originally there was only 2 cars. And so that's what they used for Goldfinger. When Goldfinger became a huge hit, then they went out and now the production company could afford some cars. So Aston Martin owned these, but they were using them. They actually bought 2 more cars, and then they had a company modify them, and they paid like $60,000 a piece getting them modified, putting all the gadgets in those 2 cars. And those second 2 cars were more pretty and more well developed, and the gadgets were put into them, and they were much more functional, but they were show cars. They meant to go to shows and be publicity cars. They weren't actually in the movie, and they weren't filmed. So those 2 cars are quite interesting, but the main one, here's the history of the first one, which this is what I thought was really interesting. Being that, it was on loan, Aston Martin owned both of the first 2 movie cars, and for some reason they decided in about 1968, they took all the gadgets off, cleaned them up, and they sold them both as just used DB5s. Now, I understand the road car, which is the one that Sean Connery actually drove, it was sold to Gavin Kezar, is the note I have here, and with about 50K on the odometer, but all the gadgets were removed, and he had another company come up with gadgets and reinstall all the gadgets to make it appear as a film. Now, I guess the work wasn't done all that well, but he was capitalizing on the car's fame. But even I guess he didn't know that it was the actual one that Sean Connery, because the 4 cars, it really wasn't known at the time which ones were which. So he had the thing, all the gadgets installed. Then in '71, he sold the car to a Richard Luce, and he had it, and he ended up selling it for $275,000 to an Anthony Pugliese. I'm not sure how to say these names, so I apologize. And he had owned it from that point on, and it was in the book as his car. And he had gotten it appraised, and it was appraised for something like $4 million. And Grundy actually agreed to insure it for 80% of its value, so it was insured for $3.2 million. And it had, all the Bond stuff and all the Bond history. But they said part of the history or the value of that particular car wasn't just because of the Bond connection and all the Bond modifications, even though they were removed and kind of recreated. But the real value of that car was the fact that it was actually the first DB5, and it was the prototype. And so they claimed that had more of the value than actually being the Bond car at the time. So it was kind of interesting, but what's really interesting is that car, it was stolen in 1997 out of the hangar, the airplane hangar that he stored it on, and that car has not been seen since. But there's a whole lot more to the story of that car, what the value was, some lawsuits. So there's a lot to it and a lot more reading. So it's kind of interesting, the full-on history of that car. The second car, the gadget car, also owned by Aston Martin. Same thing. It was stripped of all its gadgets and sold in 1968 to Jerry Lee. And understand he paid $12,000 for it. Didn't really say how much the other guy paid, but he paid $12,000 for it. And he showed it a few times without any of the gadgets, and it had gotten damaged. And he was really upset about that, so he vowed that he would not show the car again. He was just going to keep it for his own enjoyment, which he did. And in 1977, Aston Martin asked him to show it at the New York Auto Show. And they even paid and had all the gadgets reinstalled in that car. So they had it all reinstalled and redone, and that car was shown in 1977 at the auto show, or what, maybe 80 or 78. Not really sure, but the New York Auto Show. And then it was shown one more time in 1981, and he kept it for himself, locked away. And that car was not seen for a number of years. But only until somewhat recently, it went to RM Auctions on October 10th of 2010, and it sold for $4.6 million. So it's kind of crazy money. Another thing, the other 2 cars, I found this fascinating too. The other 2 cars, the prop cars, or the promotional cars that the production company owned, they sold both of them to a single guy who bought both of them for $3,500 a piece. What a bargain. And all of the gadgets were left on those cars. They were not removed. The production company sold it to him. And he had somebody who was actually bugging him to really get their hands on, one of them. And he even traded him straight across, get this, a 64 Ferrari GTO straight across for this Aston Martin, which today these are valued. Actually, I think that particular car just went to auction and was sold for $6.4 million in the past year. I think it was less, maybe in the past 6 months, which I didn't know that one. That was when I was pulling up my history. I found that out. But yeah, it recently sold for $6.4 million. And he traded it straight across for this car, the Ferrari GTO. Oh, and that guy supposedly still owns that 64 GTO, a Ferrari GTO, which would be worth $40 million. So that's a good trade in today's market, because I guess the record is $53 million for one of those GTOs. But don't know this particular car or its condition. He's owned it all this time from the mid 70s, early 70s to now. He still owns that car. But he sold his other one of these Bond cars, the promotional car. So he ended up selling both of them, but he held on to one for a while. But the other one he only had for 6 months and traded it for the GTO. So I don't blame him for that. Quite the story. One other footnote that I didn't know was going on. Aston Martin is currently making these now. Started production earlier this year. They're making 25 of them. They're calling them the Goldfinger DB5s, and they're putting all of the Bond features on them. They're calling them the continuation cars, which I find that fascinating. Limited to 25 cars, but they're going to make 28 of them. Aston Martin's keeping one. Production company that owns Bond is keeping one. There's the 28th one is going to go to auction for charity, but 25 of them being sold to people who can afford to pay the $3.4 million to buy them. The other part of it is they're technically 2020 cars by Aston Martin, but they're accurate replicas of the 65 cars. So they may not be road legal depending on where you live, if you can afford to buy one, because they don't have any of the emission stuff. They're not current. They have all of the correct 65 stuff. So depending on the country you live in or where you're at, you may not be able to drive it on the road. I guess in the U.S. that may be less of a problem because our current laws have changed on replicas and continuations, where you can get away with doing that in the U.S. But depending on where you live and what state, you may or may not be able to put that on the road, but that's up to the buyer. So on this kit, I accidentally bought the Revell DB4 kit thinking the Bond car, and then I realized getting it home and looking up reference photos that it was a DB5, this car, and not the DB4. So I'm like, alright, no big deal, I'll build that eventually. But so when this kit came in front of me, and it's the Doyusha, I'm not even sure how to pronounce the manufacturer name, but I'll put a picture of the box. But it's the one that came with the figures, Bond and Oddjob. And it's a curbside kit. As you can see, I can't open the hood. But I built it right out of the box. It has all of the Bond features. It has the tire shredders, the smoke screen in the back here, and many of the other features. The bullet windscreen, tracking equipment, the ejector seat, of course. That's a signature Bond feature. Oil sprayer and smoke screen, revolving number plate, which is on the front, which is pretty cool. The battering rams on the front here. And these on the real car didn't actually work. They were just props. There's no way to actually extend them, but still pretty cool. And then this doesn't really work. This part doesn't move. It's just glued in place. And there you can, if you can see it in there, if the camera will get up in there. Let's see if I can get this light. Anyway, you can kind of see it in there, but the tracking system that's in there, they put all that stuff in there, and then the controls on the console. It's all pretty cool stuff. Well, they put it all in there, and it's a pretty nice kit to build, but it is curbside. There's no engine, no tranny. It builds up really easy, really well. So this was a fun, quick build for me. but a car with a ton of history of the 4 cars and lots to read about, which is what I really enjoyed. And actually, reading all that stuff made this build even more enjoyable, because this is a real easy build right out of the box and didn't really do much. My only real issue is you can kind of see the number plate does rotate, but you see the decal is crumbling, falling apart. But it's a somewhat older kit, so I really don't touch that. And you can see the guns stuck out right there in the front, which is pretty cool features. Now they did add some things in the later movies. They did some more DB5s in the later movies. Reading about those cars, they were, I guess, carbon fiber or fiberglass copies. They didn't actually buy DB5s and use them because they only made 1,059 of them, and they're really hard to find, and nobody was willing to loan them, and they didn't want them to get damaged. And the production company, you saw in the movies, they actually destroyed a couple of them, beat them up. So they didn't want to spend $1 million for a regular DB5 just to trash it in the movie. So they did build replicas. Aston Martin helped with that, which I guess also helped spawn the recreation of these 25 cars. But I've rambled on enough about this particular car. But it's a fun car, a beautiful car, and I wonder what your thoughts are, if it's the most famous car in the world or not, globally, not just in the U.S. But I can see the point, you know, as the movie exploded and really bumped Sean Connery's career, and the Bond franchise just went from there, and whether or not this car had a good chunk to do with it, which is pretty cool to see. But I figured you would enjoy this. It was one that I enjoyed building. It's an easy build. Not really a cheap kit to buy. I don't know current values, but I know at the time when I found it, it was pretty much kind of, not really a bargain, but I was able to get it for under $100. And then, ironically, I took Odd Job in the Bond figure and the weapons. I didn't use them. I kind of wish I had kept them and painted them. I'm not real good with figures. But I ended up putting that box on eBay and selling that for like $30. And that was a few years back. So I kind of regret doing that, but not really, because I don't have the figurines. But do kind of wish that I had kept them and then eventually painted them or learned how to paint figurines. But that'll do it for today. So thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and all your comments. And please share. I do appreciate it. And you guys, you have a wonderful day.